Welcome, everybody, to a new series on the channel called Home vs. On the Go. The series will look at games that had both a home console and handheld port, while also comparing and contrasting the games in order to choose a recommendation. The series will only revolve around games that were identical under the same name, so you won't see Perfect Dark for the Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color in the series. And the games also have to have notable differences in order to be discussed, so you won't see like the Secret of Mana remake that was for the PS4 and also PS Vita. If a game has ports that were from different company consoles and handhelds, then specific episodes will focus on the consoles and handhelds by specific companies. So like one episode will only focus on Nintendo ones, and then another episode will be Sega only, so like stuff involving like Mortal Kombat games and stuff like that. So this debut episode, we'll look back at the game Crystalis, which is a game I have fond memories of. The game was released in North America on the NES back in July of 1990, and then later got a Game Boy Color port that was released in June of 2000. Now, even though the game was also released on the Nintendo Switch, PS4, PC, and Xbox One as part of the SNK 40th Anniversary Collection, I'll only be focusing today's episode on the first two ports mentioned. Now, the game's story is essentially the same on both ports, but with different intros. The NES would use videos for the intro for the whole primary layout, while the Game Boy Color port focuses more on still images to introduce the game with some animations. The name entry screens are also different, with the NES port having one in the style of a computer interaction, and the Game Boy Color port having one on a frame that with a sword above the character selection. Both games also have the protagonist getting introduced by waking from a chamber and emerging from a cave, but the visual layout differs for what you see on the screen. The NES version contains a visual life bar, character level display, monetary inventory, and experience point counter, while with the Game Boy Color port has the numbers displayed upon the start button where you want to see your levels, monetary inventory, and so forth, and the life bar is only represented by numbers in terms of your health points. The start button in the NES port also opens up in menus showing your stats and items assigned to your controller input, while the Game Boy Color port contains your stats and the option to save, load, or delete a save file. And the Game Boy Color port also has 3 save slots, while the NES port only has 2. To access your save slots from the NES port, you have to select first and then start in order to save your game in game progress. Hitting select on both versions will also open up your inventory to find your list of weapons, armor, items, and magical spells. The NES port also gives you the option to drop items with the B button if they're disposable items. You can use the A button on the Game Boy Color version to use items that you've highlighted from your inventory, while most items are used with the B button on the NES port, which is also the same button on both versions of the game that you use for your sword. Now the game, as you progress, will give you 4 swords that you have to use. Sword of Wind, Fire, Water, and Thunder, and each sword will gain a ball for a second power level up, and a bracelet for a third level power up. The Sword of Wind's second ball blast will knock away rock walls, the Sword of Fire's ball will blast away ice walls, the Sword of Water's ball will form an ice bridge across narrow waterways that have ripples on them, and the Sword of Thunder's ball will blast away steel walls that you see later on. Holding the B button with your sword without moving will charge up your sword's force level up to level 3 depending on if you have the bracelet equipped or not. So if you equip just the ball or just the sword after having the bracelet, you get to level 2, but if you equip the bracelet, you'll get up to level 3 charge. The Game Boy Color port also has its issues as it struggles with frame rate and animations while holding the buttons and watching characters move around, as well as a smaller screen size that makes gameplay more difficult, especially when it comes to trying to prepare for an oncoming attack from a moving enemy. There's also an extra cave to explore on the east side of the area to the north of the town of Leaf, where you first enter when you play the Game Boy Color port. Main antagonist also goes through name change, being known as Dragon, Draygon on the NES, and Dragonia on the Game Boy Color port. The final boss is also Dyna, or Dyna, and Dragon/Dragonia swap places when it comes to who you fight first with the final 2 battles. When you obtain a sword in the Game Boy Color port, an audio sound plays announcing which sword you've obtained. Items are also different, like the alarm flute used on the Game Boy Color port that you use before you reach the windmill. It's also known as the Flute of Alarm, which you can purchase at the NES version of the game. If you play the NES port and have either your character underleveled or you use a sword that an enemy is immune to, a ding sound will play upon your attack making contact with the enemy. Surprisingly, this issue was removed on the Game Boy Color port. It makes combat feel easier to go through, while the NES version makes it feel like a major grind just to try to get through characters and gain enough experience to level up. so there's a level up issue there. The boss battles that was biggest hassle between both games, at least on the Game Boy Color port, was Mido, aka Mado, the guy that was rolling around as a ball and shooting out shurikens, because it felt like his movement was completely unpredictable and would constantly defeat me no matter what armor I had, shield, and no matter what level my character was at. And it also constantly felt like I was getting dragged towards the character despite trying to get out of the way of his movement. The final boss battle also differs your strategy for battling and weapon availability. Your 4 swords will merge together to form the sword Crystalis before the final battle, meaning that the sword is your only option against Dyna, or Dyna, on the NES, and Dragonia on the Game Boy Color port. Other differences include changes to the plot, translation changes for when it comes to in-game dialogue, and other items also being changed around. So if you had to choose between playing Crystalis on the NES or taking the Game Boy Color version on the go, what would be the better option? I would have to recommend waiting until you get home to play the NES port. While the Game Boy Color port lifted restrictions with sword type immunity and making leveling up feel easier, the increase of difficulty due to a smaller size and issues with combat on the bosses really became a headache to deal with. You would be better off playing the different handheld game on a car ride and waiting until you got home to play the NES port rather than just playing the handheld version altogether. The Game Boy Color port is still fun and a nice change compared to the original, but I still feel the NES port is a little better in comparison for a few different reasons. So let me know in the comment section below, which port of Crystalis do you prefer? The original NES port, or the re-release we would get 10 years later on the Game Boy Color? Hopefully you enjoyed today's debut episode of the series. I hope to see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching, folks. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace out, and good day, everybody.